Díagweed go léir a cóide agus tá fáilte ród. Welcome to Be My Guest with me, Mary Honan, on Lear Media TV, supporting the Samaritans, Limerick and Tipperary, Clare's Wish Foundation in Limerick, and Deel Animal Rescue in West Limerick. And my absolutely fabulous guest today with an absolutely, I suppose, really an astonishing story is Hazel Catherine Larkin from Dublin. Hi, Hazel.
Hello, Mary. It's lovely to see you.
Are you Hazel or Hazel Catherine?
Oh, Hazel.
Hazel. Excellent. Yeah. I'm Mary Catherine, and I'm actually Mary, so that's why I asked. But Hazel, you are from Dublin originally, and you moved out of the country for many years, didn't you?
I did. Yeah, I was gone for about 12 years.
Okay.
Just over actually, because I skipped first of all from here to the UK. I had intended to just go for a fortnight, but I met my first husband, so I ended up staying for longer than a fortnight. I was there for about a year and a half, and then we moved back to where he came from, and he was Singaporean, so okay. I moved to Singapore. As the young bride of a local, and that was very interesting because back in the mid-90s it was not populated by as many white faces as it is now. It was still, you know, there were still obviously immigrants there. I mean, the entire population of Singapore really is immigrants. But there were certainly white people from various countries. But I know that when I first arrived, there were fewer than 200 Irish families in Singapore. And just to give you an idea, I mean, Singapore is essentially the size of Cork County. But at that time, it had a population of just under 5 million. So it was the population of Ireland in a geography the size of Cork County, exactly. And it was such a fascinating place to arrive into, because my experience of it was very different from most white people's experience, because I was there as the wife of the local. So I wasn't the trailing spouse. I was also very young in comparison to other
expat.
But expat is a funny term because we only call white people expats. Whereas I was an immigrant. You know, I left Ireland because there was no reason to stay, you know, for economic reasons. So, you know, I was an economic migrant the same way as anybody moving to Ireland would be these days. But it was but yes, it was interesting because my experience of Singapore was quite different. So I had, I suppose, a foot in both camps, in as much as if I went out with the Irish diaspora or with other foreigners, it was all about going to the club, and you know, by that I mean the country club, you know, the British club or the Dutch club, and it was all quite
Irish club.
No, there wasn't an Irish club. We didn't even have an Irish embassy at that time. Our nearest consular mission was there was an honorary consulate in Indonesia, because I lived there for a while. I remember getting my new passport in Jakarta. But the nearest really was in Delhi. So it wasn't until 1999 that we got our first ambassador to Singapore, and he had previously been stationed in KL in Malaysia. So that was interesting.
Did you like it did you like it in Singapore?
I found it interesting. There was a lot to like. There was a lot that was difficult because of the circumstances that I was in. I was there as I said, the wife of a local. So I was living more like a local than a foreigner in many respects. My day-to-day life was very much the life of a local. But there were added stresses because he was quite the handful himself.
Yeah.
You know, he had been on the run from the police when I met him, which I hadn't realized.
Oh my God.
Yes. So he was a complete fantasist. He was textbook psychopath.
Yeah.
So that was difficult, to put things mildly, because the entire time that I had lived with him in the UK, he had a fabricated backstory for himself. I didn't know, until about 3 or 4 months before we left the country, that he was actually Singaporean to start with, because he had this very elaborate backstory for himself because he was on the run from the police.
But did that alarm bells when you actually found out 3 months before you left for Singapore? Did that not start raising alarm bells? God, I mean, why didn't he tell me this, that he was from Singapore?
But of course, yeah, of course it did. I mean, I found out because I went snooping, and I went through his briefcase, which clearly I shouldn't have done, but actually clearly I should have, because it told me who I was living with, because I didn't know. So yeah, well, did it set alarm bells ringing? I was certainly terribly hurt because he had been lying to me for so long, the entire time we'd been together.
Where had he told you he was from?
He told me he was from France, and he had an entire backstory invented, that he had been adopted by a French family who had that he'd been born in the Philippines and adopted by a French family and brought to France. But it wasn't just that he was telling me this. He had a number of French people who were also telling me this, who were pretending to be his mother and his brother and his best friend and stuff from the village where he'd allegedly grown up. It was ridiculous.
You should write a book about that.
Oh, I did. I have. Yes, yeah. The book is called Gullible Travels, for obvious reasons.
Gullible amazing name. Oh, that is. I have to read that book.
There it is.
I'm definitely going to read that.
Yeah, so well then I won't give any more spoilers, but yes.
This interview happened so quickly. I didn't have time to actually.
Oh, sure. Yeah, no, I appreciate that. But but in terms of alarm bells, not exactly, because where I was coming from, given the childhood and the dysfunction and the abuse that I was coming from, it wasn't that far removed from what I'd grown up to. Sure, I'd been lied to all my life. I'd been abused my entire life. So this abuse wasn't as bad as that abuse. So, and he was calling it love, because he said that he lied to me to protect me. And, he lied to me until the day I left, and even after, but it was, but that made life difficult because we went long back in Asia, and he was arrested by the police. For the crimes that he had committed, and he was on bail for pretty much our entire marriage of several years, but he would have to report to the police station and be interrogated practically every month, and he would leave in the morning to go to the police station, and I had no idea if I was ever going to see him again, if he was coming back, and if he did. And if he didn't, and the stress of that was quite phenomenal, because I was living on a 2-week social visit pass the entire time that I was in Singapore. Now, legally, I wasn't there illegally, but it had to be renewed every 2 weeks because he was dodgy. So I wasn't accorded status, because even though I had a Singaporean husband, he wasn't. He was shady. So I was guilty by association.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So immigration did not look. Yeah.
But Hazel, take me back, if you don't mind, I suppose, to earlier. What it was about your childhood, if you don't mind talking about it. If you do,
sure.
Please feel free not to. But what was it about your childhood that is it something about us, and I say us because I know a little, not childhood or anything like that, but meeting the wrong people in our lives because they see people who are vulnerable. Is it something about about people, certain people that send off this aura that I'm vulnerable. What was it? What was it in your childhood that prepared you, I suppose, or set you up so to meet somebody like him? You say
Well,
that you had trauma in your childhood.
yeah, I don't know, Mary, that we necessarily send off signals of vulnerability. I think that's because I used to think that myself, because I think that's what the literature tells us, that there is somehow some sort of red light on our foreheads or something that attracts people. But I think that it's slightly more sophisticated than that. I think
Yeah.
it's because trauma. So to I suppose to backpedal slightly. My history is that I was raised by a narcissistic mother, which has its own corollaries. And I have my father then is a psychopath. And he abused me from the time sexually abused me from the time I was about 2. And he trafficked me for the purposes of sexual exploitation until I was about 5. And then I was, and I say this with very heavy scare quotes, too old for the pedophiles he was involved with. And my elder brothers sexually abused me as well, then from the time I was about 7 until they left to go to university or to go to college. They didn't go to university, but until they left the family home. So there was no loving background. I hadn't been exposed to any kind of parental love or any kind of familial love. I didn't have the one good adult that we're told now, that psychology will tell us that every child, whatever their disadvantage, if they have one good adult, they'll survive, they'll be fine. And I didn't have the one good adult. So, and by that I mean there was no aunt, there was no uncle, there was no grandparents, there was nobody who was on my side. It was very much without any sort of love or affection when I was growing up. Touch was abuse. It was either because you were being hit or because you were being sexually molested. There was never a loving touch. There was never that motivation for any sort of attention. It was horrendous.
I just thank God. I mean, I just thank God, and I always say it when I see people who are gone through the same as you have, and I say to myself, my God Almighty, no matter how many problems you have in your life, I grew up with a fabulous, I couldn't have had a better childhood, albeit I was separated, say, from my grandparents in England, and ideally that would have been my choice, that we'd all have been there and all together. And children that are separated from grandparents have their own issues growing up and things like that. But I do think that I was so lucky that I grew up in a stable and strong childhood, and I can't imagine what you went through. I just can't imagine it for any child.
Well, but I think that's what feeds into the vulnerability and the fact that it was easy, I suppose, for somebody like my first husband to prey on me, was because in order to survive that level of abuse and that level of dysfunction, I mean, the Eastern Health Board at the time, the predecessor of the HSE, noted in files that my family was that I was living in a dangerously dysfunctional family. And a very dangerous environment, and they just refused to act to remove me. I mean, so there were systemic failures as well. The organizations and the agencies that should have helped didn't. So there was a lot of collusion on behalf of society. But that's I'll park that for a second, because my point is that when you grow up in that sort of a situation, the only way for you to survive is to ignore your instinct. Yes. Because our instinct is that bit that tells us we need to, whether or not we're in a safe space. And as a child who's been abused by the people who should be her primary caregivers, in order to survive that situation, you've got to almost turn off the instinct, stop listening to it. Because your instinct will say, leave, get out, go, you're not safe here. But where do you go? As a small child, you can't, and you can't quite understand what's going on with you. So you just stop listening to it. But you don't automatically know how to start listening to it again when you're an adult. So even I would imagine that at 19 or 20, if I had been able to hear my instinct, it was probably absolutely bellowing at me to get away from this man. But I couldn't hear it. So I couldn't act on my instinct. I was acting on the visual cues and the auditory clues that I was getting from this man. Who was
to leave that man because he represented stability to you. He represented in some way something that you were so used to in your life. And I would imagine if you left that you would feel that, what am I to do? Because
no, it wasn't that. It was actually that he represented something that I had never had. That he, in terms of he told me after 5 days that he loved me and he wanted to marry me. And that's utterly ridiculous. That is a red flag. But you don't know that when you're 19.
No.
You think that is huge, but also, you think it's hugely romantic. But in the area of domestic violence, we'll say that that's a huge red flag. That love bombing, that moving very quickly, or that attempt and that desire to move a relationship along very quickly. But because I had no understanding of what it actually was like to be loved, didn't love myself, to be honest.
Yeah.
I was hearing what he was saying. I was seeing that he wanted to be with me all of the time. I was seeing that he was getting quite annoyed if other men were around. And I was interpreting that as love because that is what I was being told it was. I had nothing to measure it against. Yeah. I had no sense of myself as being in any way worthwhile. So I was picking up on these external clues rather than having any internal sense of being able to measure what was going on and be able to make an actual informed decision. So I just kind of went along with what I was being told. He said, "I love you, will you marry me?" I said, "Yeah, that's a great idea." Found out over a year later that he'd been lying through his teeth the whole time. He wasn't who he said he was. And he had this whole other life and this whole other family and this whole other thing going on the other side of the world.
What was it like for you living on your own while he was incarcerated?
Oh, he was never in prison. He was on bail for the entire time that we were married, but he was
arrested. He was actually arrested.
He was arrested, yeah, and he was held just overnight or for 2 days. But I was actually at work in Bangkok at the time, and I didn't know. I tried to phone him that night and I couldn't get through and I couldn't find him, and I thought that was a bit odd. And then when I said to him the next time I spoke to him, he kind of fudged the details, but he was always fudging the details. Yeah. So I also knew not to pursue things if I kind of thought, no, that doesn't add up. I knew I'd been trained, if you like, at that stage, not to interrogate too much because he would lose his temper, and that was never a pretty sight. So I just, you just leave
and
it.
You had nobody to turn to. You hadn't a family member. You hadn't.
But I never had anybody to turn to. Even if I'd been an artist, who would I have turned to? Because what use was my family anyway? So I just muddled along because I also thought, well, I've married him now, so it's. This is my life. This is my marriage.
Were your family ever held to account for their actions? Was your father ever held to account for his actions?
No. In spite of a confession, the DPP refused to prosecute. But the DPP does that. I mean, we know that.
Well, and he confessed.
Yeah. Well, he said what he did. He said, well, it was just trivial. It was what did it matter? And I belonged to him anyway. So, but he had no difficulty saying what he'd done. Now, he didn't admit to everything he'd done, but then they never do. But yeah, no, he has. Look, when I was in, again, another organization that let me down, I was in so-called therapy in the sexual assault unit the St. Louise's, which is the children's sexual assault unit in Crumlin Hospital here in Dublin. And the head of that unit at the time, so this was 88 or 89, a woman called Imelda Ryan, and she told my father that he just needed to be more gentle. That he needed to treat me with more sensitivity. knowing that he was abusing me. She didn't say stop. She didn't say hang on till I call the police. She said, I refer to that because I got that. I have that in, I got an FOI, so I have my files. So I have seen that letter where she wrote that herself. So I refer to it as the rape her more gently letter, because, that's essentially what she said to him.
And what reaction was there to her? Was she fired?
Not at all. She's held in great esteem to this day. She retired only a few years ago, and she, does things like lectures people on what to do if a child discloses, and it just makes me laugh. Actually, it makes me very angry, because she shouldn't be anywhere near children, and she shouldn't be anywhere near child sexual abuse. But she is. This is Ireland. This is what happens.
I'm in shock. I just can't believe DPP would actually not prosecute a man who has admitted sexually assaulting his child.
Yeah.
I'm shocked, but not surprised. I don't know. I really don't know what to say. I don't know why you had to suffer that.
Because that is the society that we live in, Mary. Because they say it takes a village to raise a child. And I've given a paper before, because my contention is that it takes a village to abuse a child as well. Because there were people who knew, the clergy knew I was being abused, because I did actually confide in a friend at school when I was a teenager. And bless her heart, she immediately realized that this was something that we couldn't keep to ourselves, that we needed to, let the adults know. And we spoke to a nun at the school, and her solution was to call the principal of the school where my brothers were, who was also a priest. And his reaction was shock, because these are such good boys. It's like, and so? But he told the local GP, who, and again, I have this documented, because I'm not making stuff up, because it's bad enough. I don't need to make anything up. But the doctor's response was for the priest to find out exactly what was going on and how often it was going on, and basically to interrogate me. Because the doctor's concern was not that I was being abused, and his concern wasn't about stopping the abuse. The doctor said, we need to make sure she doesn't get pregnant, because the village couldn't cope with the scandal. That was the priority. Not the child who was being abused, but the fact that there might be a scandal about it. This isn't 100 years ago.
No, this was only in the 90s. This was
in the 80s and the 90s, yeah, late 80s. So the doctor, the local doctor, the clergy, the HSE, the medical profession inside Crumlin Hospital, everybody knew. Nobody did anything. And the problem is that I am not an aberration. I don't want to think about how many thousands of Hazels in this country right now. And you see, the desperate thing is, Mary, that I actually survived. Most people don't.
But that, is it something, I don't want to say that some people are stronger than other people, but there's some people that have this, maybe not so much a will to survive, but a kind of, well, damn you. If you're going to do this to me, I'm going to find a way of getting back at you in some way, and in some little way that I suppose is a form of hope, because you're hoping that you can actually find a way out of this, either through somebody else helping you in the case of your first husband, or you finding a way to actually solve or to talk about your problems, and therefore trying to find a solution for them through your writing and through working with the HSE, which I know you work now with the HSE as you work in mental health as a counsellor or
No, what I do is I consult.
Yeah.
I'm finishing up a PhD, and what I do is I consult to various agencies, and at times I've consulted to the HSE. And before the hack, I was in discussions with TUSA around offering, because I offer help to. I have support groups that I run for parents who are sexually abused as children. I run support groups and workshops for daughters of narcissistic mothers, and I also work with other people who have similar backgrounds, similar difficulties, generally around child sexual abuse. I work as a doula with pregnant women. But again, I choose to only work with women who are sexually abused as children, because at this stage there's enough doulas in the country for people who don't have those additional needs. And I've also I have some online work as well. I have just released I have a workshop called Woman Love Thyself, which is detailing how I had to go and figure out how to love myself after all those years of never being loved and never being shown what love was like, and trying to figure that out for myself. So it's a series of exercises that.
Did all of this, sorry for interrupting you, did all of this bubble up to the surface again with the recent case? Because I know you were on News Talk at one stage talking about your own complex post-traumatic stress and the effect of it, and how you even got to the stage within your own life of taking your own life and that of your children's. And what I was actually struck by was what one quote that I read about you, which said that basically, and to paraphrase it, as much afraid as you were that the HSE were going to take your children from you, you were more afraid that they wouldn't take them from you, because you had actually wrung the HSE to take your children from you, because you were afraid you were going to take their lives. And the HSE directed you to the Gardaí in the Phoenix Park, because it was coming up to 4 o'clock.
On a Friday, and they were going home, yeah.
And God forbid you should actually be a nuisance to them at coming up to 4 o'clock on a Friday. Do you know that the lives of your children should be? But did you find that with the recent situation with the mother that killed her 3 children, that took the lives of her 3 children, but was found innocent or not guilty of murder due to insanity? And again, she had been a patient for many, many years and had been herself suffering from post trauma. And did you find that this all brought it back up to the surface for you again?
No.
Were you able to empathize with her?
Yes, I was, and that's why I spoke out first of all, was because I was very concerned that she was going to be vilified on social media, or indeed in the mainstream media, and I didn't want that for her, because I knew what that felt like. I was approaching it from an understanding that in our minds, when we are that unwell and that overwhelmed by trauma, and in that space where it really doesn't seem as if there is any other logical conclusion but death, that feels like the most loving thing that you can do, that it isn't about controlling your children, and it isn't about denying them a life. It's about saving them from the life that you're convinced they're going to have. You know, that I had been so long at that stage trying to piece myself together, trying to pull myself back from suicidal ideation. You know, for years and years, I was never more than 2 steps away from thinking about killing myself, from having a plan. I had detailed plans, and if people would say to me, do you have a plan? I'd say no, because I knew that if I said yes and gave details, they would undo that for me. They would prevent me from, they'd block off my escape route, as it were. And I did not want that. I needed to have that. I needed to know that there were ways that I could kill myself, that nobody would interfere with. And obviously, I'm not going to go into that because that would be irresponsible of me to discuss that. But it is.
I mean, Deirdre Morley, that case. I mean, when she was given medication following the trial, it's ironic that she said, had I got this medication last week, my 3 children would not have been dead. I feel that, I feel more myself now. What is it about? How much do you think that the authorities have the responsibility of what happened? Because, this was a woman who had been for years going to psychiatrists and counselors. And do you think, like her husband feels that the family should be included in talks about something as severe as I want to kill my children? I contemplate, I think she said at one stage, I often dream that I'm in France and I'm on my own without the children. And that she had talked to psychiatrists about feeling so despairing that she wanted to take the lives of her children. And nobody consulted her husband or her in-laws or anybody that could have watched her or been more careful with her, known how to talk to her or whatever, or to take the burden away from her on occasions if they felt that she had, was being under pressure with 3 children. Do you know that she was left on her own, more or less, as far as I can see? Am I wrong?
Well, no, I think that we have, again, as a society, that we're very prone to just leave women to get on with things. We expect women to be able to do everything. And it's an unfortunate fact that telling women that we can have everything, unfortunately, means that we're expected to do everything. Yeah. We're expected to take care of the home, our spouses, our children, our jobs, our parents, our in-laws. There is a huge burden on women that isn't interrogated or unpacked enough. But to answer your question about whether or not the family should have been included, yes, I absolutely do believe that. Yeah. And I do think that there should be a mechanism whereby people, when we're in the whole of our health, when we're not unwell, that we can nominate somebody like to be part of our multidisciplinary team when we are unwell. To nominate whether it's a sister or a spouse or the neighbor down the road, but somebody that you trust and that will have your best interests at heart, who will be party to the decisions that are made for and about you when you're unwell. And also not just be party to the decisions, but to know what's going on, not necessarily to breach breach confidences, but to say things like, well, you need to make sure that your wife takes this particular medication and it needs to be taken this many times a day, and just watch, because these are the side effects, and be careful of them, or and ring the GP if there's a problem. To keep a family member informed. Because over and over again, we see that once a person turns 18, their invested others, their families, the people who love them, no longer have any right to their medical information unless and until that person shares it. And that's not particularly safe. I don't think it's best practice. No, certainly parents don't necessarily need the information if their child is on contraception, for example. But if my child is potentially suicidal, you're damn right I want the doctor to tell me. Or if there is another issue, it doesn't have to go to the extreme of suicide. But even if it is something that help.
Sorry for interrupting. I'm just thinking, you see, of a father's a few years ago who actually he killed his children
Yes.
And he was suffering from anxiety and depression, and he pleaded guilty to trying to murder his 4 children, and he sentenced to prison. But I was listening to a woman the other day whose 2 daughters were killed by her husband. He drove off with the children and drove off up here, and she was talking about the same thing as you're saying about the importance of including the family when somebody is so. I mean, she said at times she was trying to force the medication into his mouth like a 4-year-old to try and get him to take the tablets on time and regularly. And she said she never had any inkling whatsoever that he was going to go to the extreme of killing their 2 little girls. But he did. And I am of the belief as well, and I have to say it's a very, very sensitive subject, but I am of the belief that the family should be informed when somebody, but then you're worried, are you breaking, as you say, the confidentiality, the patient doctor confidentiality? But when it's something where a patient actually confides in their doctor that they're planning on either killing their spouse or their children, that is when others need to be brought in, and the family need to be brought in. You know, I think in this situation, there's no winners and there's no losers. There's no winners certainly in this. You know, there was a lot of mistakes made. I mean, her husband should certainly have known so that he could have helped her.
Yeah, and I don't think that it should be that we should wait till things get to the extreme. It shouldn't be only when somebody discloses that they're a danger to themselves or others, or they may be a danger to themselves or others. It should be in advance of that. It should be actually, you know what, your spouse or your child or whoever it is you're concerned about, they've taken a dip this week. They're not great this week. They're just going to need an extra bit of support. You know, so that is provided from way early on, so things don't get to the extreme where somebody is suicidal. Because when we're suicidal, we're very logical. It's a different kind of logic.
Yeah.
And we're very clever. So, you know, at hiding things, you know, and I've made that point that on the times when I have come closest to being suicidal, I looked less suicidal than at other times. Because I don't present as that textbook. My affect isn't immediately obvious. I'm not sitting there crying, going, "There's no hope." I already know there's no hope. At that stage, you know, I have decided in my head that it's quite clear there's no hope. I keep trying to fix things. I keep going for therapy. I keep trying to change things. Nothing works. I always end up back where I am. So the conclusion there is, to stop trying to do the same thing over and over again, because that's the definition of stupidity. And I'm not stupid. So what do I do instead? Well, the logical thing is I stop doing, and I stop doing everything. So it's to get the intervention well before we get there is what's important.
And you know something, I mean, I've interviewed a lot of people who were victims of genocide and victims in particular of the Holocaust, children during the Holocaust. Who are now adults and their children, and it's amazing the generational effect that it can have, not just the children themselves growing up, but on their relationships with their own children. Some of them want to talk about it, others don't want to talk about it. Some are overprotective of their own children, some don't even have any relationships with their children. But the one thing that all of them had, and that all of them strove for, was hope. There's, you know, and Viktor Frankl says you can live without faith and you can live without love. But the one thing you can't live without, the one thing that will keep you going, even in the worst of times, is this messianic hope, that not necessarily in a God or a God figure or a Messiah figure, but in the belief that tomorrow will be better. Or if I do this, maybe I can be better tomorrow. And I'll wait till tomorrow and I might feel better tomorrow. That's in itself a hope that maybe tomorrow is going to be better. And that's what got those through who got through. Of
Yes.
course, others who had hope, and they experienced a hopeless situation, and they died, and nobody was without some sense of hope. But that's what kept them going. Was that what kept you going? Was this sense that things will get better?
No, because by the time I was suicidal, I had realized that things weren't going to get better. And things
Yeah.
didn't get better, Mary. They didn't. You know, that I had run out of hope at that stage. There was no hope left, and there was nothing to hope for. Why on earth would I believe that things were going to get better? Where was the proof? Show me the evidence. There isn't any. So the logical thing to do was to actually just shuffle off and kill myself. Because what was the point? I didn't need another 20 years or another 30 years of this nonsense.
So what turned it around?
It's the simplest thing, Mary. It was being reached out to and being treated like a human being, being told that I mattered. And actually, you know, somebody's humanity reaching out to my humanity and seeing that spark within me and saying, it matters to me that you stay alive. It matters to me that you just hang in there for another day. Just do today. And actually it got to the stage where the Samaritans were ringing me.
That's yeah.
I was on suicide watch. So every it was every 4 hours, and then it was every 6 hours, and then it was every 12 hours until I got more stable help. But I had people from Belfast, because I had been studying at the time in Queen's, ringing me to make sure that I was okay, and extracting an assurance from me that I would stay alive until the next phone call. And that's how I got through about a week or 10 days with people. And it was the same person. There were two different people who rang, and it was a reconnection. You know, they'd been linking in with me and saying, and how are you today? And there had clearly been active listening, because they were referring back to other things I'd said, and there were conversations happening that were quote unquote normal conversations. It wasn't just, and tell me how you feel now, and promise me you're not going to kill yourself. It was like, and what's the weather like there then in Kildare today? And you know, there's the sales are starting here, and so it was normal conversation. It wasn't just centered around my mental health and how I was doing. That was how the conversation started. But and then the conversations were finished once the person on the other end felt that I was all right to be let go. And again, that they would extract the promise that I would stay alive, not for their, you know, for their statistics, but because I mattered. Because I was
you mattered.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what kept me. It is somebody reaching out from their humanness and finding my humanness and saying that the spark that's in there, that matters. You can't let that go out, because there's a way around. We'll find a solution. We'll find a reason for you to want to stay.
Have you found that with COVID, that COVID has brought its own sense of or own set of problems, if you like, or has it been therapeutic for you to you're able to do things on Zoom anyway? I don't know what are you studying at for your PhD? What are you researching?
I am researching the relationship between mothers and daughters where both have a history of child sexual abuse. So it's trauma and transgenerational trauma, and the societal framework that allows and encourages and permits and promotes child abuse. Yeah. That's what I'm looking at.
So it's given COVID lockdown has given you plenty of time to actually do research and to actually write, but
it hasn't done me any favors.
No,
it's.
I would imagine that it's back to, you know, the one thing that we are as human beings is tactile people, and like to be around, whether it's a hug. I mean, you don't even have to say something to somebody, just to get a hug from them speaks volumes. And when you're deprived of that, if you're suffering with, I mean, we've all suffered, I suppose, depression at times, especially after the death of my parents and being an only child. And I didn't have aunts or uncles. My mother was an only child. So I found COVID for me was in a kind of like, as an only child, I was used to my own company. So I was able to find things to do and keep occupied. On the other hand, on the occasions when I really wanted somebody to talk to, unless it was Zoom and these chats and these interviews and that, which I found therapeutic in a sense, because you got to talk to people who you never would have met, but for the fact that we were forced onto Zoom because our station couldn't start up normally when we were starting. But I just found that there was nobody, none of my friends I could meet and have a hug or anything from. So you had to kind of wade your own way through the stress or the grief or the loneliness or the isolation on your own. And that was what I found hard at times, when on those occasions that I was looking for somebody to just sit with and talk to. Did you ever feel like that?
No, because I live with my children. My girls are 17 and 19, so there was always somebody around for a hug. And we were very good. I mean, as you can imagine, the conversations around mental health in this house are very open. So we would always, we'd check in on each other. And I'm very fortunate that my daughters are very fond of each other. They're each other's best friends.
That's lovely.
So it is lovely, yeah. And it meant that we were, the three of us in the house and the two cats. So there was always
a hugely successful mother.
I've put a lot of work into it. Yeah.
You have been a hugely successful mother. Any mother that can say that her two children like each other is a hugely successful mother.
Well, they love each other. I mean, that's the, and they will. That's how they finish every phone conversation before they hang up. They will tell each other that they love each other, and that when they're apart, they will miss each other. What my eldest daughter was away, she was bereaved. The closest thing she had to a granny, her boyfriend's granny died last week, and so she was with the family, what we'll call the in-laws. I mean, they've been together nearly 4 years, so they are practically the in-laws. And my younger daughter was saying that she really missed her and she couldn't wait till she got home. And then they go off and they spend time together just catching up because they haven't seen each other for 3 days, and it's lovely.
Well, Hazel, thank you so very much for being my guest today, because I know you're actually rushing for another meeting. And
yes, the American's up in 2 minutes.
It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, and I wish you every success in your future and in your academia.
Thank you.
And I'm sure you'll be an asset to anybody and any company and any organization that you'll be.
That's very kind of you. Thank you. And I was delighted to have been asked to speak to you today. I'm grateful that you made the call. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Hazel. Shindera leis Clare, that's the end of the show for today. Until the next time, the Cúnamh Day. But Wallam Galer Chiacana, Sonas Agus Gra. I wish you peace, happiness, and love. Agus Gadeshiv Slán. Slán.
Gur míle mágad, Mary Slán.